SpaceX team. I'm Kate Downey, and I want to tell you about my favorite way to save fuel on the trip to Mars, aerobraking. Landing a spacecraft on another planet is hard, and usually requires a lot of fuel. Fuel is heavy and expensive. So we have the Earth, thick atmosphere, the Moon, no atmosphere, and Mars, thin atmosphere. How do we get a spacecraft from the Earth to Mars and make it slow down enough to land safely?
Grape on a chopstick, which will be our spacecraft.
When you're landing a spacecraft on the Earth, the atmosphere is thick enough to create enough friction and drag to slow the aircraft down. Now you could do what we do when we land on the Moon, which has no atmosphere. You retrofire rockets to slow down the spacecraft enough to safely land on the Moon. To do this method on Mars, you'd have to leave Earth with what is technically known as a crap ton of fuel, which is both really freaking expensive and leaves less room for scientific equipment. There is an equation called the rocket equation that tells you how much fuel you need to get a certain amount of weight to a certain place. How can a spacecraft leave Earth with as little fuel as possible and still slow down enough to land on Mars? Remember when you were a kid on the swings, there were always those kids who would swing really high and jump off at the top of the swing and land on the ground. I was always too much of a wimp to do that, so I would slow myself down by scraping my feet on the ground every time my feet got close. Turns out you can use that same method to land a spacecraft on Mars. As the spacecraft speeds towards Mars, it uses Mars's gravity to swing into an elliptical orbit, which just means an elongated oval orbit around Mars. Now, the point at which the spacecraft is the furthest away from Mars is called the apoapsis, and the point at which it's the closest to Mars is called the periapsis. So you want to slow the spacecraft down, and they do this by firing the retro rockets just a little bit to get it slightly closer to the atmosphere in the periapsis, scraping against the atmosphere and slowing the spacecraft down just a tiny bit, which actually makes the apoapsis a little bit closer to Mars. On every orbit, the spacecraft scrapes a little bit along the atmosphere on the periapsis, slowing it down just a tiny, tiny bit. Sometimes they repeat this maneuver for over 6 months. Finally, they're ready to fire the rockets one more time and land on Mars. And that's how you land on Mars using aerobraking, the same way a wimpy kid jumps off a swing.